Good evening. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen an old map and noticed names that no longer exist? Have you ever walked past a building so massive, so strangely designed, that you wondered if our ancestors knew something we've forgotten? And have you ever asked yourself, how much of history is truth, and how much has been carefully rewritten? Tonight, we step into a story that is equal parts history, mystery, and possibility. A story that has sparked curiosity for centuries, yet is almost absent from the textbooks. The story of a civilization so vast, its name once stretched across entire continents, and yet today, most people have never even heard of it. That name is Tartaria. But before we dive in, I want to ask you a few questions. How certain are you that the history we've been taught is complete? Do you believe that empires can simply vanish, leaving little more than ruins and whispers behind? And if an entire civilization could be erased from our collective memory, what does that say about the history we're told every day? As we journey together, we'll explore more than just maps and ruins. We'll explore technologies that may have been lost to time, technologies of resonance, energy, and architecture that hint at knowledge far beyond their era. We'll compare Tartaria to Rome, to Byzantium, to the Ottomans and the British Empire, asking not just how it might have competed, but how it might have dominated. And then, we'll ask the biggest question of all. What if Tartaria had survived into the present? What would our world look like if their technologies had shaped the future? This documentary isn't about giving you all the answers. It's about opening the door to a conversation that's larger than any one of us. It's about following the evidence where it leads, whether to truth, to myth, or to something in between. Because sometimes, the most dangerous stories are the ones that were erased, not the ones that were written. So, as we begin this 3-hour journey across maps, legends, and alternate timelines, I want you to keep an open mind. Question what you see, question what you've been taught, and ask yourself, if Tartaria really did exist, why were we told to forget it? If you enjoy exploring mysteries like this, stories of lost civilizations, hidden technologies, and alternate histories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive. Your support helps us keep uncovering the forgotten corners of the past, and it helps this community of truth seekers grow. Now, take a deep breath, look at the world around you with fresh eyes, and get ready to step into the shadows of history, where forgotten empires still whisper, and where Tartaria waits for us to remember its name. History is full of names that echo like thunder. Rome, Egypt, Babylon. Each conjures images that have survived millennia. Marble columns, pyramids carved against the desert sky, walls so thick that even time gnawed them slowly. These names are the pillars upon which we build our sense of the past. But there is another name, once written boldly across maps, whispered in chronicles, and carried in the mouths of travelers from east to west. A name so vast it stretched like a banner across half the known world. Tartaria. Today, the word feels foreign on the tongue, a riddle with no answer. Few schoolchildren have heard it. Fewer adults could tell you what it means. And yet, for centuries, Tartaria was as real on parchment as any empire. Its domain spanned Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and beyond. It loomed so large that maps gave it pride of place, letters stretching across an ocean of land like a shadow no sun could erase. And then, it was gone. By the late 19th century, the word had vanished from atlases. Encyclopedias dismissed it as a geographical error, a quirk of outdated charts. Where the name once thundered, silence reigned. But silence is never empty. Silence begs questions. Why would generations of cartographers, missionaries, and merchants agree on a word? only for later scholars to insist it was nothing. Why would maps produced with painstaking accuracy grant such space to Tartaria if it were only a placeholder? And why, when its traces were erased from official history, did whispers persist, in folklore, in ruins, in memories that would not entirely die? This is not simply a story about an empire. It is about erasure, about memory and the forces that shape it, about the possibility that history is not a neutral record, but a narrative sculpted by those who win and those who fear what came before them. Imagine you are a sailor in the 17th century. Your ship departs from Amsterdam. It sails fat with the breath of the sea. In your cabin lies a map. It shows the world in bright, ambitious colors. New Spain in the Americas, the Mughal Empire in India, Ming China in the east, and sprawling across northern Asia, immense and almost unbroken, a single label, Tartaria Magna. There is no question in your mind that it exists. How could there be? The map says so. Travelers returning from Moscow speak of vast territories, peopled by fierce horsemen. Jesuits in Beijing mention Tartars as neighbors. It is as accepted a fact as the Pope in Rome or the Sultan in Istanbul. Yet 3 centuries later, that same map would be considered quaint, even comical. Professors would tell their students that Tartaria was a lazy catch-all, a cartographic shorthand for lands Europeans did not yet understand. Nothing more. But then, why does it appear so consistently? Why is it referenced in documents from Venice to Paris, Moscow to Beijing? Why do entire regions, Siberian, Central Asian, Mongolian, once grouped together under the banner of Tartaria, suddenly fragment into smaller manageable identities only after the empire's name is scrubbed? The erasure is suspicious not because history forgot. History forgets often. The erasure is suspicious because forgetting seems to have been enforced. Consider this. Empires fall, but their names linger. The Aztec Empire crumbled, but we still call its people Aztecs. Carthage was razed, but the word remains. Byzantium became Istanbul, but no one denies Byzantium existed. Yet Tartaria, larger than all of these, disappeared not only as a power but as a concept. This is the first puzzle in our journey. The story of Tartaria cannot be told in straight lines. It is a labyrinth of maps, ruins, silences, and contradictions. Some call it conspiracy, others call it forgotten history, still others call it myth. Perhaps it is all three, but if we are to understand why a name was erased, we must first sit with its weight. Picture the endless steppe. Grass stretches to the horizon, undulating like the surface of the sea. Above, the sky is vast and pitiless, a blue so wide it seems to swallow time. Across this expanse, caravans once creaked along the Silk Road, carrying silk, spices, and stories. Here, horsemen thundered in loose formation, arrows singing through the air. Here, cities rose where rivers bent, only to vanish centuries later, leaving little more than stone bones half buried in the earth. This was the canvas upon which the word Tartaria was written. It was not a single city like Rome, not a single river like the Nile. It was the idea of immensity, of peoples whose histories did not align with European neatness. It was, in short, a riddle that Europe preferred not to solve. But whispers tell another story. They speak of towers that drew power from the air, of cities aligned with geometry too perfect for chance, of cataclysms that buried entire civilizations under waves of mud and ash. They speak of rulers who commanded not by sword alone, but by knowledge that now lies forgotten. Are these only legends? Perhaps, but legends often carry fragments of truth, smuggled through time by those denied the right to write. And so, as we open this chronicle of Tartaria, we do so with caution and with wonder. The task before us is not to prove or disprove, It is to follow the echoes where they lead, to allow the possibility that the past is stranger than we imagine, and that what has been erased may yet be remembered. In the chapters to come, we will move slowly, as one would through a ruin whose stones might still shift underfoot. We will begin with the maps, the parchment witnesses that recorded Tartaria in ink. We will walk among the monuments whose size and design raise more questions than answers. We will sift through the ashes of cataclysms, and we will press our ears to the silences enforced by those who came later. We will listen to folklore, weigh the evidence, and wrestle with the possibility of suppression by design. And finally, we will confront the reckoning that such a story demands. If Tartaria was real, what does its erasure reveal about those who decide what we remember? History is not only about what is written, it is about what is erased, what is silenced, what is allowed to rot in locked vaults. The story of Tartaria begins with a name, bold, immense, impossible to ignore. And it begins again with its disappearance, a vanishing act so thorough it begs us to ask, who erased Tartaria and why? This is the empire the world forgot, or rather the empire the world was told to forget. Our journey begins now. Maps are supposed to be trustworthy things. They are meant to represent the world as it is, lines and borders sketched with careful hands, rivers following their courses like threads of truth. But the deeper you go into the archives of cartography, the more the certainty frays. For there you will find maps that should not exist, maps that tell a story we are no longer permitted to remember. The name Tartaria sprawls across them like a kingdom that refuses to vanish. 16th century Venetian maps, 17th century Dutch engravings, 18th century French atlases, all carry it, etched boldly across half of Asia. Tartaria Magna, Great Tartari, written in the same confident ink as Persia, India, and China. These are not obscure doodles in the margins of forgotten travelers. They are professional charts, sold and distributed to merchants, sailors, scholars, and monarchs. For centuries, Tartaria was there, inescapable, undeniable, and then all at once, it was gone. We begin in Venice, 1561. A cartographer bends over vellum, candlelight staining his fingers gold. He shades in the coasts of the Black Sea, marks the Caucasus Mountains like teeth. And as his quill drifts north and east, he writes Tartaria. His map will travel across Europe, carried in ships, purchased by noblemen, studied by scholars. It will shape the way the world understands itself. Why would he invent it? Why would dozens, then hundreds, of cartographers repeat the invention across centuries? Placeholders vanish as knowledge advances. Sea monsters fade when oceans are mapped. Unknown interior dissolves when rivers are charted. But Tartaria lingered. Its persistence suggests not ignorance, but memory. Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century write from Beijing of encounters with the Tartars. Their letters describe great distances, formidable armies, strange customs. They never pause to ask, who are these Tartars? Because for them, it is obvious. Everyone already knows. Tartaria is a fact. Travelers in Moscow tell of vast territories to the east, where Russian authority frays into uncertainty. They speak of Khans who still command loyalty, of caravans that vanish into the horizon. To them, Tartaria is no myth. It is a neighbor, a challenge, a rival. And yet, when the 19th century dawns, a transformation occurs. Maps that once bore Tartaria now show only Russia, Mongolia, Manchuria. Encyclopedias reduce Tartaria to a footnote, a vague label, a European misunderstanding. The name disappears, erased from public memory as thoroughly as chalk washed from slate. If Tartaria were nothing but error, its removal might make sense. But then why did the error last so long? Why did it appear across languages, across centuries, in documents created by professionals whose lives depended on accuracy? The vanishing act feels less like correction and more like censorship. Walk into any archive, pull a map from the 17th century, and you will see it, Tartaria. Written with confidence, spread across lands we now divide into tidy nations. But open a modern atlas, and it is gone. The difference is jarring, like reading two books that describe entirely different worlds. Some say the cartographers simply lacked information, lumping unknown peoples into one convenient name. But the records suggest otherwise. They reference specific cities, rulers, armies. They describe encounters with people who called themselves by names now forgotten. To dismiss all this as error is to underestimate the intelligence and rigor of those who came before us. So the maps become our first mystery, our first witnesses. They whisper, something was here, something vast, something erased. And to follow their whispers, we must leave parchment behind and step into the realm of stone. For an empire, no matter how thoroughly erased, leaves traces in what it builds. If maps are one witness, travelers are another. Their letters, journals, and chronicles preserve impressions of worlds now vanished, sometimes in single lines that survive the centuries like threads of smoke. 17th century Jesuits describe their journeys from Beijing toward the north. They speak of endless distances, horsemen who appear suddenly on the horizon, fortresses crumbling under the weight of time. They write of peoples who call themselves heirs to forgotten khans, of banners fluttering with strange symbols. They do not call these lands Siberia, they call them Tartaria. Russian envoys traveling eastward in the 18th century described territories so vast that weeks of travel yielded no sign of Moscow's authority. They encountered rulers who demanded tribute, armies whose discipline startled them. These were not nomads wandering without structure, but peoples with order, with laws, with memory. Merchants along the Silk Road write of caravans that vanish into the steppes, swallowed not by bandits or storms, but by powers whose names they do not dare record. To them, Tartaria was not an abstraction. It was a reality that could decide whether their goods reached Europe or rotted in some forgotten city. And yet, the more travelers wrote, the more Europe seemed to forget. Their testimonies piled in archives, only to be dismissed later as exaggeration, as error. How convenient that the voices who spoke of Tartaria became unreliable, precisely when the empire's name was being erased. But memory clings. Even in folklore, Tartaria persists. Stories of kings whose banners stretched from ocean to ocean, of palaces gleaming with domes that seemed to drink sunlight, of fortresses swallowed by the earth. Myths, perhaps, but myths are often the shadows cast by truths. So we gather these travelers' whispers, fragile though they are. Each one adds another stroke to the portrait of Tartaria, a portrait that will grow clearer as we turn to its architecture, the monuments that still stand, too stubborn to vanish. Civilizations leave monuments, and monuments outlast names. Rome is gone, but its arches stand. Egypt's pharaohs are dust, but their pyramids still slice the sky. If Tartaria existed, its fingerprints must lie in stone. Across Eurasia, strange fortresses dot the land. They are not crude palisades or accidental hills, but vast, deliberate constructions, star forts, geometric, symmetrical, aligned with precision that astonishes modern engineers. From Russia to Poland, India to Siberia, they spread like a constellation across the earth. Official history tells us they are the work of Renaissance engineers, exported eastward. But the sheer scale, the uncanny similarity across continents, raises questions. Were these truly scattered imitations, or remnants of a single system, a grid of defense and power, stretching across an empire later called Tartaria? In Kazan, domes and minarets rise beside orthodox spires, an architectural clash that speaks of conquest. But some believe these were not Russian creations at all, but Tartarian palaces repurposed by victors. In St. Petersburg, palaces gleam with grandeur attributed to European architects, but the speed of their construction, the vastness of their design, suggest they may have been inherited rather than built anew. Buildings outlive rulers, and rulers rewrite their stories. Perhaps Russia and Europe did not build from scratch. Perhaps they claim the bones of Tartaria as their own. The monuments remain, stubborn as stone, whispering of a civilization we are told never existed. To silence them, one must invent new stories, new names, new attributions. But the geometry speaks for itself. And as we walk among these structures, we feel the weight of fire and flood. For every empire of stone eventually meets catastrophe. History is written above ground, but sometimes it lies buried below. Across Eurasia, countless buildings reveal strange scars, windows buried beneath street level, doors that open directly into soil, ground floors that function as basements. Officially, these are the result of poor planning, changes in street height, or natural erosion, but another theory whispers louder: the mud flood. According to this idea, a cataclysm once swept across cities, drowning them not in water but in earth. Entire ground levels disappeared beneath a tide of mud, entombing civilizations in a single instant. Survivors rebuilt atop the ruins, inheriting cities they did not build. The evidence lies in plain sight. Walk the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, or old cities across Siberia. Look down. Windows lie half buried, doors open into dirt, entire floors sleep beneath our feet. Are these quirks of architecture or scars of disaster? If true, the mud flood may have been the hammer blow that shattered Tartaria, a natural catastrophe, or perhaps something more sinister, a reset engineered to bury not just buildings, but memory. For what better way to erase an empire than to drown its cities in mud and then convince the survivors they built what they inherited? The ground beneath our feet may yet hold Tartaria's bones, but catastrophe is only half the story. For erasure also requires intent. Every empire meets disaster. Babylon fell to fire, Pompeii to ash, Atlantis, if it existed, to waves. If Tartaria lived, it too must have burned. Russian chronicles tell of wars fought against Kanates across the steppe, battles fierce and merciless, cities reduced to rubble, survivors absorbed into the expanding empire. Jesuit accounts whisper of fortresses abandoned, palaces left to rot. But war alone cannot explain the scale of disappearance. Mudflood theories suggest catastrophe. Fires recorded in chronicles speak of cities engulfed in nights of flame, their ruins rebuilt and renamed. Was Tartaria undone by conquest, by disaster, or by both? Perhaps the truth lies not in a single cause, but in convergence. An empire weakened by flood, finished by fire, erased by victors eager to claim its grandeur. The result is the same: silence. But silence itself is suspicious. To lose a battle is one thing. To lose even the memory of an empire, that demands explanation. And so we turn now to the strange void left in history. By the 19th century, Tartaria was gone. Not just politically, not just geographically, but narratively. Maps no longer named it. Textbooks ignored it. Scholars dismissed it. This is unusual. Empires fall, but their names persist. Aztecs, Byzantines, Mongols, all remembered. Tartaria alone was erased. Why? Some claim ignorance. Others suggest deliberate suppression. Perhaps Europe and Russia, dividing its lands, found it inconvenient to admit a rival had existed. Perhaps the name itself carried implications of grandeur they wished to claim as their own. The result is the Great Silence, a gap in history where an empire should be. But silence is not nothing. Silence is a message. And in this silence, betrayal resides. History likes clean timelines. Empires rise, empires fall, and neat arrows move across classroom posters, as though destiny were a train schedule. But what if history didn't simply move on from Tartaria? What if it reset? The word reset sounds theatrical until you start collecting anomalies. City centers with ground floors inexplicably buried. Civic buildings whose dates of completion arrive suspiciously fast, as if some vast template already existed and a new regime merely signed the facade. Star-shaped fortresses whose geometry replicates with unnerving precision across continents, like stamps pressed into clay. Calendars reformed, archives burned by accident, census categories invented and then weaponized. The pattern is not proof, but it is rhythm. In this rhythm, some hear the drumbeat of a great reset, a twofold event, first physical, then narrative. A material shock that crippled the old order, followed by a bureaucratic campaign that recast the wreckage as the foundation stones of a triumphant modern state. Flood, fire, famine, choose your horseman, then choose your historian. Consider the way technologies disappear, not simply superseded, but forgotten. Domes and spires tuned to resonance, bell towers designed like instruments, ringing not only to mark the hour, but to move something subtler in the air. Buildings aligned so precisely to cardinal directions and geodesics that the plan reads less like architecture and more like notation. We say aesthetic because that is a comfortable word. But what if beauty was the wrapper for function? What if Tartarian cities were harmonics, and the reset was not only to topple walls, but to muffle frequencies? Skeptics will say this is romance masquerading as history. Yet the skeptics must answer a different question. Why the haste to normalize the abnormal? Why the rush, after calamity, to rename districts, reassign dates, translate titles, and draft a new syllabus of the past? If Tartaria was only cartographers' laziness, why did pedagogy labor so hard to erase the laziness? Resets have fingerprints. They leave generation gaps. Elders whose childhoods describe a world the textbooks don't. They leave mismatched keys. Doors whose locks predate their alleged builders. They leave orphaned crafts. Trades that train apprentices to maintain objects no one admits to designing. Follow those fingerprints, and the reset begins to look less like a single night of terror and more like a decade-long season of amnesia, enforced by necessity and curated by power. A season in which the debris of one civilization was sifted, sorted, and repurposed to frame the origin story of another. If Tartaria's name vanished in that sorting, perhaps it was because the new story needed a cleaner prologue. Whether the reset was a freak of nature or a feat of policy, the effect was the same. A world of inherited stone rebranded as newly built, its energetic grammar broken into decoration, its memory translated into myth, its name retired with honors it was never allowed to accept. And yet, even resets leak. When the water recedes, it leaves rings on the wall. When paper fails, voices carry. In the villages that sit like beads along the old caravan routes, stories endure that do not care what atlases say. They are told by firelight, or in the thin blue of dawn, in kitchens that smell of fermentation and smoke, by grandparents who laugh at their own melancholy. A Bashkir lullaby that mentions a city with 10 gates, each sounding a different note. A Tuvan epic where the hero rides not to conquest, but to the tower where wind itself is taught obedience. A Chuvash wedding chant that offers bread to the keepers beneath the street. A phrase that makes no sense now unless one knows to look for buried windows and doors. There is a Mongolian proverb, names are the shadows of roads. If a name vanishes, but the proverb remains, perhaps the road still runs beneath the soil. Folklore is a map drawn in metaphor. Its accuracy is not cartographic, but topological. The shape of memory preserved even as its place names change. Ask elders about the Tatar past, and the answers arrive like pebbles dropped into a well. Some strike water, some knock on stone. You will hear of banners that wandered like auroras across the steppe, of treaties made with sky and river rather than with courts, of bells that silence thunderstorms, of a palace whose dome sang like a wineglass when the moon stood at a certain height. Sift these tales, and you begin to glimpse a pattern that history's prose rejects as poetic excess, an empire that understood the world as a score and wrote its cities to the music. The logic is foreign to the industrial mind, and because it is foreign, easily dismissed. But the dismissal is itself data. What a culture mocks often betrays what it cannot comprehend. Even the jokes matter. In Kazan, there is an old gag about a bureaucrat who orders a church modernized by removing its unnecessary harmonics. The punchline is a shrug. The storms return. Whether the story is satire or souvenir, it keeps alive a memory of purpose disguised as ornament. We do not need folklore to prove Tartaria existed. We need it to understand how it might have existed. Folklore rescues temperament, the way a civilization thought about order and beauty, duty and power. When official chronicles are shredded into confetti to celebrate the opening of a new parliament, temperament survives in songs. And in those songs, the name that went missing returns by periphrasis, the realm that tuned the wind. If you require a Latin label for that, you will be disappointed. If you are willing to listen, you will hear Tartaria hum. Stand in a hall built before the erasure and clap your hands. The echo does not merely return, it chooses a path. In some rooms, a syllable becomes a chord. In others, a whisper carries farther than a shout. Architects chalk this up to volumes and vaults, to plaster and curvature. True. But in city after city, across thousands of miles, the same accidents repeat with a deliberation that begins to feel like code. The domes, onion, saucer, parabolic, are not simply pretty caps. Their proportions recur in ratios that turn up in instrument-making manuals. The bell towers, ostensibly local signatures, share internal scaffolds that amplify specific bands of frequency. Even the street grids of certain quarters, when plotted, reveal harmonic progressions, not quite music, yet something more than convenience. There are facades with cavities that behave like Helmholtz resonators, courtyards that cancel wind eddies, arcades that channel footfall into the subsoil like mild, constant percussion. One can explain each of these features in isolation. Together they suggest an urbanism that thought in waves, not only in walls. Was this the machinery of Tartaria? Not gears and pistons, but resonance and field, an engineering of atmospheres? If so, the reset need not have detonated the apparatus to defeat it. It needed only to disrupt the tuning, alter bell alloys, change dome heights, shift the orientation of a street by 3 degrees, call the old designs superstition, then permit them to crumble. A city detuned becomes a shell. Later generations inherit the shell and conclude, reasonably enough, that it was only decor. Forgive the speculation. But speculation, disciplined by attention, is the bridge between ruin and meaning. The evidence lies in stone and space, in repeating choices made far from one another, by builders who did not attend the same academies, who nonetheless drew from a library of forms no university now teaches. Consider also what survived intact. Baths whose hypocausts breathe, cisterns scaled to cycles of drought, Star forts with dry moats that function as ground planes, not merely obstacles. The old cities treat water as a sovereign partner, wind as ally or adversary, light as ingredient. We call this vernacular, as if it were accidental wisdom. But the regularity of the solutions, their elegance, their recurrence, whispers of a curriculum. When the reset came, that curriculum was not debated. It was deprecated. The manuals turned into curiosities. The names of master builders became surnames detached from craft. The apprentices became handymen, praised for their flexibility, while their lineage of knowledge was treated as a hobby. The machinery of stone still runs, in places where maintenance masquerades as piety. A caretaker rubs beeswax into a wooden balustrade because his father did. Ask him why, and he will say, "It keeps the house alive." He does not mean metaphor, he means exactly what he says. Erasure is never just forgetting, it is administration. First comes renaming. Provinces are rechristened with terms that emphasize geography over genealogy. Steppe, mountain, river. Names that once pointed to allegiance are recast as bland descriptions of terrain. Loyalists become locals. Dynasts become bandits. A civilization becomes a collection of ecosystems awaiting management. Then comes translation. Charters written in languages that braided law with cosmology are rendered into bureaucratic prose. Meanings sloof away. A phrase that once meant the river's consent becomes water rights adequate. The translators are not villains. They are professionals incentivized to standardize. Standardization is the velvet glove of conquest. Then comes curriculum. A generation enters new schools, where maps have been quietly redrawn. The teacher does not lie. The teacher is simply given a reduced palette of truths. Children repeat the names that fit the new order, and within a decade the old names sound like the nicknames of ghosts. Finally, the architecture of legitimacy is rebuilt. Museums display artifacts detached from their contexts, presented as curios of folk genius rather than as components of an integrated system. Cathedrals and mosques are framed as expressions of faith rather than as engines of civic life. Star forts become evidence of European influence. A pattern that might suggest a civilization is reframed as evidence of its absence. You do not need a conspiracy when you have a policy. You do not need censors when you have syllabi. Suppression by design wears a suit, stamps a document, and files the past where it will not embarrass the present. And yet, the filing cabinets rattle at night. A registrar notices that too many deeds in one district were reissued within a narrow window, after a flood, say, or a fire. A surveyor measures a street and discovers a royal cubit hidden in the paving. A violin maker recognizes the ratio in a rooftop. These are the tremors that precede a reopening of the case. Because erasure is labor, and labor leaves ledgers. If you want to know what was, ask those who did not write it down because they were too busy carrying it. In the taiga, the Evenki still recite wayfinding chants that list rivers in an order no mapmaker would choose, because the order follows sound. In the tundra, Nenet's herders teach children to read snow like script. In the Altai, old men still ease their shoulders when they pass beneath certain arches, a gesture as unconscious as breathing, inherited from an etiquette that believed stone had temperament. These are not remnants, they are continuities. The people who European maps flattened into Tartars were never one thing, but their differences once rhymed. Intermarriage, trade, shared rites of passage, festivals that synchronized calendars across distances so great the feat itself implies administration. A confederation, perhaps, or an ecology of sovereignties governed by treaties we can no longer read because we burned the metaphors that made them legible. Listen to a Buryat grandmother explain why she keeps a copper bowl under her bed. So the house remembers the river. Ask her whether this is superstition, and she will laugh kindly. No, she says, this is plumbing. The joke lands because the boundary between ritual and utility has been exaggerated by our age. For her, they are the same discipline, alignment. A Kazakh blacksmith shows you a tool whose form has not changed in 200 years. We used to fix the city bells, he says, and then corrects himself, embarrassed by a memory he has been told is irrelevant. Not used to. The metal still wants the same things. Survivor is a difficult word. It implies a disaster so total that only fragments float. But the North does not float. It walks, it sings, it repairs, it remembers in verbs. What we call folklore may be manuals written in melody. What we call superstition may be the maintenance schedule of a civilization that chose song as its archive because parchment burns. The task is not to romanticize, it is to recognize. To see in these practices not picturesque archaism, but an unbroken transmission of pattern, the kind of pattern that once scaled into a polity. Call that polity Tartaria, or call it 1,000 names. The people who carry its grammar do not need the label. We need it, so that our maps of the mind stop pretending there was ever a blank. Climax does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives like the moment a crowd sees the image in a stereogram. A collective gasp as scattered dots become depth. By now the fragments have accrued. Maps that refuse to be errors. Monuments that behave like instruments. Catastrophes that look, in hindsight, like opportunities for takeover. Policies that filed memory into silence. Lifeways that preserve a grammar of alignment. What, then, is the simplest story that holds them together without breaking? Not a monolith, but a matrix. Not a throne, but a network. Tartaria, as the maps named it, was likely not an empire in the Roman sense. Legal uniformity imposed from a capital, but a civilizational operating system. A shared toolkit of engineering, calendrics, diplomacy, and festival that allowed widely different peoples to remain interoperable across distances that would break most polities. Its symbol was not the crown, it was the bell. Its genius was not conquest, it was tuning, of land use to water, of building to sky, of ritual to season, of market to journey. Such a system could survive leadership changes, border wars, and local tragedies, until one day it could not. When catastrophe detuned cities and policies retuned education, the toolkit fractured. Successor states found it easier to inherit the hardware and deny the software. They took the domes but not the mode. They adopted the star forts but not the field. They kept the calendars but trimmed the holy days that synchronized a continent. Why erase the name? Because a matrix embarrasses a monarchy. Because a toolkit available to many undermines the legitimacy of the few. Because a civilization built on alignment can be dismembered only if you convince the survivors that resonance was always superstition. Erasure protects the new license to rule. The revelation is not that Tartaria was magical. It is that it was practical, at a scale we forgot was possible. Its hidden power was subsidiarity, married to synchronization, local autonomy braided into continental rhythm. Its capital was the calendar, its constitution was the festival, its army was the road, its cathedral was the sky. The gasp is not wonder at lost perfection. It is recognition that something like this could be attempted again. Once you see the image in the dots, you cannot unsee it. But recognition is not permission to declare certainty. The reckoning begins with discipline. We must relearn how to hold ambiguity without surrendering to either credulity or cynicism. Credulity grabs the most romantic explanation and baptizes it truth. Cynicism refuses to look through the stereogram at all, insisting there are only dots. Both positions are forms of laziness. The work is in between. What does that work look like? Triangulation, cross-reading maps with soil surveys, pairing folklore motifs with acoustic tests, dating timbers, and then asking why the dates cluster after recorded fires, scanning buried flaws, and then interviewing families who have always known those flaws were there. It looks like humility, admitting that a bell tower might be more than a bell tower, without insisting it must therefore be a power plant. It looks like respect, allowing living communities to define the use of their knowledge rather than strip mining it for content. The reckoning also asks us to interrogate our own hunger. Why do we want Tartaria to be real? Because we despise the boredom of textbooks? Because we suffer from imperial nostalgia? Or because we sense, honestly, that our cities have been tuned to commerce and convenience while starving the parts of us that crave alignment? Good questions all. The answers need not be pure to be useful. A civilization does not return because we post about it. It returns when we practice its grammar with enough patience that our descendants experience continuity instead of narrative. Holding the evidence and our longings in the same hand, we can do something more luminous than reconstruct a vanished state. We can recover a standard of care for land, water, light, time, and one another, that the reset interrupted but did not kill. History will not congratulate us, it does not clap. But sometimes, if we are quiet, you can hear it stop scratching out a correction, and for a moment, listen. Names return first as curiosities, a meme, a marginal note in a thesis brave enough to risk a footnote to embarrassment. Then as hypotheses that refuse to die under peer review, not because editors conspire, but because the evidence will not stay filed. Then, if we are lucky, as field schools and apprenticeships and building codes that rediscover the old ratios, this time tested by sensors as well as songs. The name Tartaria will never recover its borders. That is not the point. What returns is its usefulness, as shorthand for a civilization-scale alignment ethic, as a working term for a networked polity, resilient to reset, because it treats memory as a civic utility, not a luxury. As a reminder that advanced can mean consonant rather than merely complicated. In a small city in the north, a planning board votes to shift a new boulevard by 3 degrees to respect the wind. The minutes cite heritage considerations, a phrase blessedly dull, while the old men nod as if a word half remembered has been pronounced correctly for the first time in a century. In a coastal town, bells are retuned to an older interval after a storm surge behaves as if sound were a tool. In a university, a course titled Resonant Urbanism fills overnight, and the professor, who began as a cautious skeptic, finds herself humming as she walks through streets that suddenly feel less hostile. Online noise will surround the name's return. There will be gaudy claims and angry rebuttals. Let them pass. The work is local, sober, iterative. It smells like beeswax and lime mortar. It sounds like children learning solfège so they can help evaluate a dome. It looks like a map whose legend includes stories recorded, with as much dignity as elevations measured. When a name returns in this way, it does not resurrect an empire. It rehabilitates a relationship with earth and time, with ancestors and descendants. The flag that rises is invisible, a calendar restored to convivial sanity, a street that breathes, a house that remembers the river. At that point, whether archives ever yield a single royal charter stamped Tartaria will matter less than the fact that you can stand in your city and feel it tuned. We end, as all honest histories end, with a mirror. Tartaria is there, or it is not, depending on the angle of the light and the patience of the viewer. What is certainly there is the outline of ourselves, our craving for coherence, our suspicion that something vital was misfiled, our hope that we can rebuild not only buildings, but agreements. Walk your streets with that hope. Notice the buried window, the oddly musical stairwell, the corner where the wind stalls every afternoon, and ask whether the old builders meant to make sanctuary there. Learn the feast days of your neighborhood, not the official ones, but the rhythms of market and migratory bird, of tide and thaw. Retune one small thing, a room, a bell, a habit, and watch how quickly memory finds it. If Tartaria was only a mapmaker's convenience, then we have lost nothing by behaving as if it were more. The practices we recover, alignment, resonance, subsidiarity, celebration, do not require proof of a vanished crown. They require only neighbors. If Tartaria was real, if its matrix held for centuries, and its name was erased by a reset that mistook dominance for order, then to speak the name again is not nostalgia, it is repair. Either way, the mirror instructs. The empire we can rebuild is not a dominion over others, but a sovereignty over forgetfulness. To remember wisely is a political act. To harmonize beauty with function is a moral one. To treat silence not as void, but as archive, is the beginning of citizenship. The wind will carry whatever we build next. Let it carry a grammar that does not humiliate the stones. Let it carry a name we have learned to say without insisting that it behave like a border. Let it carry our laughter the way the old cities did, softening the air so that strangers feel expected. History will not close the file on Tartaria for us. We must decide what the word will mean from here. If we choose alignment, the world that forgot might remember. And if we choose erasure again, the wind will go on, accusing empty ledgers in locked rooms, and some future people will wonder why our maps are so small. For now, step outside. Listen, your city is already trying to speak. The story of Tartaria begins not with battlefields or thrones, but with stone. Silent, immovable, stubborn stone that refuses to tell us whether it will cut for beauty or for function. Yet within its silence lie hints of an entire civilization's genius. Imagine standing in the middle of a ruined fortress on the Siberian steppe. Grass rolls in endless waves, the sky presses down like a blue ocean, and scattered around you lie walls carved at strange angles, fragments of star-shaped bastions, too vast and precise for the local chronicles to explain. To most historians, these are anomalies, quirks of imported European engineering, or the improvisations of local Khans imitating foreign styles. But to those willing to listen closer, the stone whispers of something more. What if these fortresses were not imitations, but inheritances? What if they belonged not to the conquerors who claimed them, but to a civilization that had already mastered a different kind of science? A science of resonance, balance, and harmony. A science we struggle to name because our language has forgotten the categories to contain it. The idea seems fantastical until you realize how much we take for granted in our own age. Flip a switch, and light blooms. Speak into a device, and your voice leaps continents. We no longer marvel at these miracles because they have been domesticated, parceled out into textbooks and manuals. But imagine explaining Wi-Fi to a medieval monk. Imagine describing nuclear power to a Roman centurion. They would call it magic, even as we insist it is merely science. So why should we not consider the possibility that Tartaria, if it existed, practiced sciences that appear to us as legends, technologies hidden in architecture, encoded in domes and towers, woven into festivals and rituals, dismissed as superstition because we no longer understand the grammar. Walk through St. Petersburg and look carefully at the palaces. Their construction dates are suspiciously compressed. Vast, ornate complexes, allegedly raised in decades by nations still struggling to industrialize. The Winter Palace alone, with its sweeping facades and endless corridors, would have required materials and labor on a scale that challenges belief. Official histories explain it as the work of Peter the Great's imported European architects, aided by thousands of serfs. But the timelines do not always add up. The techniques seem too advanced, the symmetry too deliberate. Now shift your eyes. Look not at the grandeur, but at the details. The domes shaped like bells, the arches that channel sound, the towers that resemble tuning forks. Look at the alignment of streets with solstices, the placement of plazas at nodal points of resonance. Suddenly, the city feels less like ornament and more like instrument, less like imitation, more like inheritance. Could it be that these cities were not built from scratch by Russia, but claimed, modified, and rebranded? Could it be that they were Tartarian at their core, machines of stone, humming with forgotten purpose? Consider the star forts. These strange symmetrical structures appear across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas. Historians attribute them to Renaissance engineers, spreading military innovations like seeds along colonial routes. But their sheer ubiquity raises questions. How could so many fortresses, so precise in geometry, arise independently across such distances? How did builders in remote Siberian towns replicate patterns identical to those in Italy or India? One possibility: they did not replicate at all. They inherited. The forts were Tartaria's network, a grid of resonant nodes across the earth, amplifying and balancing forces we barely comprehend. Their star shapes were not only defensive, they were harmonic, dispersing energy like ripples across water. Imagine these forts not just as strongholds, but as tuning points. Imagine them humming in unison across the empire, sustaining balance in ways modern physics has only begun to glimpse. Skeptics will scoff, as they always do. They will demand proof, instruments, blueprints. But absence of proof is not proof of absence. And when you look closely at the anomalies, at the buried windows of mud-flooded buildings, at the impossible timelines of construction, at the folklore that refuses to die, you begin to sense a pattern that points to technologies hidden in plain sight. Tartaria's spark was not iron, nor steam, nor gunpowder. It was resonance. Imagine towers that captured the energy of the earth itself, transmitting it silently across landscapes, lighting homes and heating baths without smoke or flame. Imagine bells cast to frequencies that calmed storms, or that harmonized soil for planting. Imagine festivals not merely for joy, but for synchronization. Humans gathering in song and dance to align themselves with the rhythms of city and sky. This is the picture that emerges when you let the stone speak. But technology does not exist in isolation. It shapes and is shaped by society. If Tartaria built such machines of harmony, then its civilization would have been profoundly different from those we know. Where Europe mastered gunpowder and steel, Tartaria may have mastered balance. Where other empires sought expansion through conquest, Tartaria may have sought stability through resonance. What kind of people would that create? What kind of empire would that sustain? The answer lies not in stone alone, but in the stories whispered around it. In Bashkir songs of cities with 10 gates, each tuned to a different note. In Mongolian proverbs about towers that taught the wind obedience. In Kazakh, jokes about bureaucrats detuning bells and bringing back storms. These are not proofs in the scientific sense, but they are echoes, shadows of a memory that refused to vanish, even when the name Tartaria was erased. Imagine being a traveler, stepping into one of these cities at their height. The air itself feels different, alive with vibration. The streets are wide, aligned with the sun. Water runs clear in channels that double as acoustic conduits. Children laugh as they play with toys that resonate when struck, learning harmony before they learn arithmetic. Bells toll, and the city shifts, as though breathing in time with itself. It is not magic, it is engineering. An engineering we have forgotten, but that once shaped the daily life of millions. If this was Tartaria's spark, then it explains both its resilience and its vulnerability. A civilization built on resonance would be stable, able to thrive for centuries without exhausting resources. But it would also be fragile, disrupt the harmony, and the system falters. Flood the cities with mud, detune the bells, destroy the towers, and the network collapses. What was once power becomes puzzle. What was once life becomes legend. The spark in stone is both promise and warning. It hints at a civilization that understood the world differently, through vibration, through balance, through alignment. And it forces us to ask, if Tartaria truly mastered such technologies, how would it have fared against the empires we know? Rome, China, the Ottomans, Britain. Would resonance have conquered steel, bureaucracy, cannon, and navy? That is the story we must follow next. But never forget, it begins here, in stone that hums if you dare to listen. Stone hums, but stone alone is not enough. If Tartaria was built upon resonance, then it must have learned to master not just architecture, but the invisible forces threading the world together. Air, water, light, magnetism. These were their engines, the quiet, enduring technologies that transformed environment into power. Imagine a field outside a Tartarian city. At first glance it is ordinary. Rows of grain bending in the wind, canals glinting under the sun. But listen closely. Small towers rise at the edges, their frames of copper and stone humming faintly. When the wind picks up, they do not resist it. They sing with it, harmonizing to amplify vibration into usable force. Farmers walk barefoot between the rows, feeling the tremor in the soil. They are not guessing when to sow or when to water. They are reading the resonance, tuning their work to the rhythm of the land. This is not superstition. It is precision, encoded in bells, crystals, and towers. Where we see ornament, they may have seen instrument. Consider air. Modern science tells us that vibration travels through it, carrying sound, frequency, energy. Tartarian towers, domes, spires, parabolic arcs may have been designed to shape that vibration deliberately. Some frequencies could amplify rainfall, coaxing moisture into crops. Others might stabilize temperature in markets and baths. Bells, carefully cast, were not merely to mark hours of prayer. They were tools, each tuned to influence a specific band of vibration. The great cities, then, were not only political capitals, but laboratories of sound. Imagine streets aligned like organ pipes, amplifying the hum of daily life into resonance that sustained energy networks invisible to our eyes. Where Europe invented furnaces belching smoke, Tartaria may have invented soundscapes, urban harmonies that fed back into themselves like self-sustaining circuits. Now turn to light. Domes glinting under the sun, gilded not merely for beauty, but for function. Reflective surfaces channeling solar energy, focusing it into chambers where crystals hummed with power. Lanterns glowing without fire, lit by stored resonance. Windows carved not only to admit light, but to bend it, refract it, multiply it. It is tempting to call this fantasy. Yet consider Nikola Tesla, centuries later, dreaming of towers that could transmit wireless power. Consider modern experiments in resonance chambers, producing light and energy through vibration alone. If a single genius in the 19th century could glimpse this possibility, why could not an entire civilization in the distant past have mastered it? Perhaps they did, and perhaps the impossible buildings that still stand, the ones whose ground floors sink below earth, whose spires align with solstice and equinox, are not mysteries of aesthetics, but fragments of a lost science. And then there is water. Tartaria was a civilization of rivers and steppes, of caravans that followed the lifelines of the earth. But its relationship with water seems more deliberate than mere survival. Cisterns shaped like resonant chambers, aqueducts that doubled as harmonic amplifiers, wells that sang when struck. Imagine a system where water was not pumped with brute force, but drawn upward by vibration. Imagine fountains that rose in perfect arcs, not from pressure alone, but from resonance tuned into stone. Water carried not only life, but sound, circulating through cities as both utility and song. In such a civilization, plumbing was not separate from music. The same channels that fed crops also fed harmony, and the people living within it felt that unity in their bones. Finally, magnetism. The earth itself is a vast resonant field, a sphere of vibration pulsing beneath our feet. Modern science detects it with compasses and satellites. Tartaria may have felt it directly, building towers aligned to magnetic lines, tapping energy not from coal or oil, but from the planet itself. Consider the placement of star forts across continents. Many align suspiciously with magnetic anomalies, as though built not only for defense but for resonance. Could they have functioned as anchors in a global grid, transmitting energy across vast distances? If so, Tartaria may have possessed a wireless network centuries before Marconi. Skeptics scoff again. Where are the machines, the wires, the engines? But perhaps Tartaria did not build machines as we know them. Perhaps the cities themselves were the machines. The walls, the domes, the towers, the bells, together forming circuits on a civic scale, too large for us to recognize as technology. In our world, technology is small. Devices we hold, machines we command. In Tartaria's world, technology may have been vast. Cities that tuned themselves, landscapes that sustained themselves, people who harmonized with the systems rather than commanding them. Imagine the difference this creates. In our world, industry demands fuel, exploitation, exhaustion, forests cut, rivers dammed, mines emptied. In Tartaria's world, energy was drawn from balance. To destroy the balance would be to destroy the power. And so their civilization may have been not only advanced, but sustainable. But such harmony also breeds vulnerability. Disrupt the resonance, and the system collapses. Tilt the towers, silence the bells, flood the streets with mud, and the engines of air and light sputter into ruins. The survivors inherit shells they cannot operate. The cities fall silent, their purpose forgotten. And when the victors arrive, they see only strange buildings, too advanced to have been built by those who now inhabit them. They invent new stories, claim new authors, erase the old name. The machines become palaces. The instruments become ornament. The network becomes error. Still, the engines whisper. They whisper in buried floors, in bells that ring too long, in windows that shine too brightly. They whisper in stories of storms calmed, of rivers remembered, of lights that glowed without fire. They whisper in the very air, waiting for someone to hear them again. This was Tartaria's genius, to build not with iron and smoke, but with air and light, to turn invisible forces into daily companions, to weave technology so seamlessly into life that it looked like beauty. But beauty is fragile, and when other empires rose, empires built on steel, bureaucracy, and conquest, Tartaria's harmony faced its greatest test. History teaches by contest. A civilization does not discover itself until it meets another with a different grammar of power. If Tartaria existed as a resonant civilization, tuning cities to earth and sky, wielding architecture as engine and bell as instrument, then its first revelations would have come under pressure. Rome's discipline, Byzantium's longevity, China's bureaucracy, the Ottomans' canonry, each tested a different seam in Tartaria's fabric. The test is not merely, who would win in battle, but what happens to a society's soul when another insists the world is best understood by sword, by law, by gun, by empire. Rome meets a city that breathes. The Romans believed roads were destiny, lay stone from frontier to capital, and the world funnels its tribute. Their legions marched as if geometry itself had volunteered for war. Lines, squares, testudo, formations that turned chaos into mathematics. Against such order, hill tribes and coastal kingdoms broke like surf against a jetty. Now place that legion on the steppe, approaching a low wall that refuses spectacle. No marble triumphal arch, no boast carved above the gate. Only bastions arranged like a star drawn by a steady hand, dry ditches that confuse distance, and a meadow whose grasses ripple against the wind as if the earth were breathing. The centurions measure, mutter, align their ladders. The cornu sounds. Something is wrong. The sound does not carry. The horn's note folds back on itself. The echo returns from the wrong direction. Command depends on voice, on signal. But here, a sentence dies 10 paces from the mouth. Inside the wall, bells toll in intervals that are not Roman hours. The legionaries' steps feel heavier, not mud, mood, a pressure you cannot name. Cohorts falter not from fear, but from miscalculation. What distance was 5 javelins becomes 7. The scorpion's arc misjudges. A catapult's stone thuds short, as if the air itself had condensed. Rome's genius is adaptation. The tribune trades ladders for siege ramps, orders trenches for counter-battery. Yet the city does not answer in kind. It answers in temperament. The ramp builders find that soil here behaves differently, light, then dense, layered deliberately to collapse into itself when piled at certain angles. The trench walls hum at dusk. A mason swears he hears a chord when his shovel bites a vein of gravel. At night, a bell deeper than midnight rings from a tower. The legion's horses calm. The mules stop braying. Relief, until dawn, when the men rise slower than usual, as if waking from dreams that were not theirs. The standard still flutters, the eagle is bright, but the will to hammer a city that refuses to meet them on the terms of the hammer erodes like a cliff under a tide that does not tire. Rome withdraws, not defeated, but uninterested. The dispatch to the Senate mentions inconveniences of supply and the insufficient utility of a fort whose gates open in friendship and close in fog. Rome prefers rewards that look like revenue. Tartaria offers something subtler, a neighborhood that would rather be neighbor than subject. Rome is wise enough to know an empire can die from indigestion. Second Byzantium counts seasons. It cannot name. Byzantium is endurance with a theology. Where Rome prized roads, Byzantium prized records. Every grain that entered the city passed a count. Every monk who copied a book joined a chain. The empire outlived its rivals not by glory, but by paperwork. Law braided to liturgy, ledger braided to calendar. Send a Byzantine diplomat north to negotiate tariff and safe passage. He arrives in a city that greets him with bread that tastes of honey without honey, a market whose awnings face wind yet never flap, and a timetable that moves by bells, whose sequence does not map to canonical hours. He asks for the rule that governs these chimes. The governor smiles. Weather. Not answer enough. The diplomat notes the festival dates, the freight rotations, the opening and silencing of fountains. He recognizes a schedule, but its logic is not ecclesiastical. It is environmental. Solstice, flood pulse, migratory curve. He had thought season meant page in a missal. Here, season is the whole book. Byzantium's talent is absorption. It translates foreign forms into Greek until they become Christian. Icons drink local pigment. Law digests local custom. But when the translator reaches for Tartaria's grammar, his hand closes on air. He can list practices, he cannot legislate the temperament that makes them coherent. The temptation is to call it pagan, a convenient draw for what resists jurisdiction. Yet he does not feel impiety here, he feels competence. These people have not chosen another god, they have chosen a different way to keep time. Byzantium adjusts, it accepts the tariff, codifies the caravan duty, appoints a local as liaison to the exarch, to ensure that gold and wool and amber flow with the same predictability as the bells. The treaty lasts because it admits a truth empires like to ignore. Not every order is your order. Not every order must kneel to persist. Third, China brings gunpowder to a conversation. Where Rome made law and Byzantium made records, China made bureaucracy, a meritocracy audited by exams, an arterial network of officials moving memorials to and from the throne. Its prowess in administration matched its prowess in invention. Compass, paper, gunpowder. Against such a state, Tartaria would face not a raid, but a system. Gunpowder changes tone. Resonance might calm a horse and disorient a phalanx, but powder is percussion. It does not ask the room, it asserts upon it. Cannons batter, rocket arrows shock. Walls that sing may yet crack if battered long enough. The first Tartarian cities to hear Chinese thunder do not admire it. They answer with geometry, star bastions that refuse a single wall's collapse, glacis that bleed momentum, hornworks that channel armies into sound traps where drums lie to ears, right sounds left, near sounds far. Gunners aim by sight, their brains aim by timbre without consent. A half degree of error becomes a dozen shattered volleys. China adapts. Its engineers adjust for deflection. Its quartermasters insist on siege by hunger rather than breach. Tartaria's reply is the caravan. A city tuned to landscape will always know a back way. Supply runs to these cities look like migration, not military relief. The siege starves the besieger. What does each learn? China learns that not all walls are stone, some are fields. Tartaria learns that not all percussion can be diffused, some must be absorbed. It thickens certain bastions with layered fills that behave like sand in an hourglass under impact. It retunes bells to bands that disrupt powder's reliability, not by mysticism, but by dampening humidity curves gunpowder prefers. The war becomes a conversation, and both parties leave with new words. The Ottomans prove. Canon is a language. The Ottomans believed in a sentence that begins, "If a city has a wall," and ends, "Then we have a cannon." Their siege of Constantinople is an instruction manual written in bronze. Against Tartaria, it reads itself aloud. Canonry works on rhythm, roll, swab, load, aim, fire. The sound becomes ritual. Men keep time with their bodies. Tartaria's countermeasure is not to silence sound, but to introduce syncopation. Within range of certain towers, the timbre of explosion shifts. The gunners think the powder is wet. The engineers blame fuses. The truth is humiliating. The air is lying to them. So the Ottomans do not listen. They escalate. Bigger guns, more powder. The ground replies with a moan you feel in teeth. Some star forts buckle, some not. Those that hold share a secret. Their moats are dry not from poverty but by design. They are ground planes tuned to throw energy sideways into berms that behave like drums with skins so loose they swallow the blow. These are not metaphors, they are material properties. Ottoman sappers learn to fear soil that booms. The Ottomans are not fools, they adjust barrages, shift camps, build counterworks. They succeed sometimes, they fail often. The logbook of war fills with adjectives that do not appear in the manuals of Buddha or Edirne. The wall sang. The pitch changed. The men would not reapproach after the third bell. A civilization built on canon cannot afford to believe air has laws beyond trajectory. This is the seed of a later erasure. If you cannot reproduce a phenomenon, call it myth. If you cannot dominate a temperament, call it quaint. Both are strategies of reputation, and reputation rules the inheritance of the earth almost as decisively as armies do. When Portugal sails past a shore that refuses harbour, the sea is a referee Tartaria does not appoint. Portugal and Spain, and later Holland and England, move upon it with caravels and carracks, caravans of wood whose camels are sails. The littoral is a language Tartaria speaks awkwardly. Its genius is continental. Portuguese captains seeking a northern passage skirt coasts whose cities do not announce themselves with light. Why would they? Inland power sings inward. The harbours that would welcome trade are not yet dressed for oceanic diplomacy. The result is mutual suspicion. The sailors log a coast poorly settled. The cities log ships as storms. Tartaria learns late that global prestige has shifted maritime. It responds not with navies, the habit would be alien, but with rivers. It doubles down on inland exchange, building caravans into institutions. Where the sea unifies by port, the land unifies by fare. The Silk Road grows arteries. A man can walk from Samarkand to Kazan and sleep every third night under a vault that hums in a key his grandmother would recognize, no matter the dialect on the street. This is not defeat. It is refusal to play someone else's game at the cost of one's soul. It will look like provincialism to those who count ships. It will look like peace to those who count winters survived without famine. Sixth, the moral ledger of rivalry. What is won and lost in these first rivalries? Tartaria proves that balance can withstand shock up to a point. Rome's discipline, Byzantium's law, China's percussion, the Ottoman canon, each threatens, none abolishes. The empire of resonance endures, not by smashing rivals, but by making invasion feel like poor taste. Yet the ledger records liabilities, a civilization that tunes to landscape risks, underestimating a rival who tunes to extraction. A polity that organizes by festival may react too slowly, to a blitz that cares nothing for calendars. A city that breathes with its basin is most threatened by disasters that change the basin's breath. Flood, drought, ash. The world has not yet conspired to reset Tartaria, but the world has never lacked for storms made of weather and men. In the next age, the challenge will not be how Tartaria meets rivals, but how it meets the most patient one of all, modernity. Empires that trumpet their victories often fail to notice how they are conquered in return. Quietly, not by armies, but by habits. Tartaria, we imagine, preferred the opposite. Its triumphs were silent, absorbed by others as if they had thought of them themselves. This act follows the ways resonance traveled without banners, through markets, marriages, apprenticeships, and the unglamorous heroism of maintenance. First, markets that behave like schools. A market is a teacher that never says it is one. In Tartarian cities, the great bazaars were not only for buying and selling, they were for tuning. A caravan did not just unload wool and amber, it unloaded intervals. In the vault of a Khan's caravanserai, you could hear a bell from Kazan answer a bowl from Bukhara. A Persian dyer picks up the hum and adjusts his mordant. A Tatar potter changes the wall of a kiln by the thickness of a fingernail. Profit rides on acuity. This is conquest, not by tariff, but by taste. A Genoese merchant bought silk and carried away a memory of streets that did not tire him, of courtyards that cooled in a manner he could not replicate at home. 10 years later, a minor duke in Liguria commissions an architect to copy a facade he cannot stop thinking about. The copy misses the intervals, but catches the shadow. Another decade and a stonemason in Savoy solves a draft problem by accident and swears he heard a chord when the new lintel was set. Ideas do not respect jurisdiction, they respect satisfaction. Second marriages that rewrote maps without moving a border. A daughter of a steppe city marries into a river town. She brings copper bowls, a way of laying table that assumes air has weight, a habit of airing rugs on days when bells of a certain pitch are rung. The mother-in-law complains until the winter proves milder inside the house. Old wives' tricks, the neighbors say. 2 generations and those tricks are called local common sense. Tartaria does not draw new borders here. It draws a lattice of kinship. Trade routes were always also bridal paths. A bride's dowry might include a bell. The bell includes a frequency. The frequency includes a festival date. The festival includes a treaty. The treaty survives a war because breaking it feels like breaking the year. This is what silent conquest looks like. A calendar that makes disobedience taste like sacrilege, even to a man who claims no God. Third, the apprenticeship republic. The modern world calls itself a republic of letters. Tartaria was a republic of craft. Guilds guarded secrets, not because secrets are petty power, but because the integrity of the city depended on standards. A bell too thin sulks in rain. A dome a finger too low breeds fevers in summer. A cistern with the wrong echo grows the wrong algae. Every line in a construction manual was a clause in the social contract. When foreign apprentices arrived, because talent migrates along with hunger, the guilds did not admit them for their passports, but for their patience. 3 winters carrying brick before being allowed to mix lime. A year listening to a master strike. Defective tiles and naming the floor by ear. Apprenticeship is a love story with technique. Those who married in carried out not just skill, but ethos. They took Tartaria with them into Polish towns and Persian quarters, into Ottoman baths and Russian monasteries. Silent, steady contagion. The diplomacy of repair. Where expansionist empires sent ambassadors with rings and threats, Tartaria sent repairmen. A fort in a neighboring polity begins to crumble at the seam where 2 bastions meet. A Tartarian mason arrives with a story and a hammer. We had this problem in the north. The wind curls here, listen. He fixes the seam. He teaches the apprentice. He leaves behind a chisel that sings when tapped. Borders soften where gratitude grows. The treaty is a ledger entry. The real bond is the building that stops leaking. A city remembers those who stopped its leaks. The next census will record an increase in Tartarian names. This is not annexation, it is adoption. V. Faith without mission. Tartaria's resonance ethic did not require exclusive creeds. Mosques, churches, synagogues, temples, if they were aligned to the breath of the city, they belonged. The test was not doctrine, but tuning. A bishop who complained the bells were heathen intervals found himself preaching to an empty nave on heat-thick afternoons. The faithful had migrated to a chapel that cooled properly because its roof pitch respected the wind's dignity. The result was an ecumenism that scandalized dogmatists and soothed everyone else. Tartaria conquered by making life less exhausting. Exhaustion is the tyrant's recruiter. Ease is the republic's. Sixth, the grammar of courtesy. The conquering language is not always spoken. Sometimes it is gestured. Tartarian courtesy assumed the city was a partner. You paused beneath a lintel, not to bow to a lord, but to register the quiet the designer meant to gift you before you entered noise. You did not shout in a certain alley because the acoustics made whispers sufficient. You watered a stoop, not only to clean it, but to adjust humidity before the bells. Children learned these graces as games. Visitors adopted them because they worked. Within a season, a foreign quarter walked as if it had always known. The 7th accounting of winners. What did Tartaria gain by refusing spectacle in favor of saturation? Continuity. What did it risk? Visibility. Spectacle writes itself into the chronicles of enemies. Saturation writes itself into the bones of neighbors. When calamity comes, spectacle is remembered even in loss. Saturation is remembered in practice, but practice can be renamed by victors. The danger of silent conquest is the ease with which the conqueror later claims he invented what he merely inherited. This foreshadows Tartaria's fate under the pressures to come. When modernity arrives with coal and cable, telegraph and doctrine, it will be easier to treat old bells as curiosities than as infrastructure. And yet, for now, silent conquests accumulate like snow. The city wakes and finds itself higher than it was the night before, unable to say exactly when the drift began. The 15th through 18th centuries belong, in our timeline, to oceans. Caravels knit continents, ports rise like new capitals. In the alternate ledger, where Tartaria thrives, those centuries belong to rivers and roads refined into something more deliberate than distance, a continental nervous system. Roads that behave like rivers. A road is not simply a strip of beaten earth, it is a promise to keep it so. Tartaria treated roads as tissue, healing them with seasonal maintenance, synchronized to bells that sent crews out like white blood cells. Culverts cleared when certain intervals rang. Stone dust laid on days the humidity would set it. Milestones tuned to reflect moonlight in curves travelers could read with peripheral vision. At night, a caravan could move by resonance alone, a series of low chimes embedded in waystones, barely audible, aligned to lead beasts along safe cambers. The effect on trade was obscene by the standards of empires that thought in marches and harvests. Goods moved year-round. Perishables crossed latitudes with less spoilage than coastal cargo rotting in blockaded harbors. Insurance, yes, there was insurance, priced risk not by banditry alone, but by detuning. A route near a city whose bells had gone out after a fire cost more. Merchants funded rebuilding not from piety, but from actuarial love. The second fairs, that behave like parliaments. Great fairs convened not merely to hawk wares, but to harmonize policy. In Novgorod, in Samarkand, in Kazan, delegates from guilds and caravans met under vaults that magnified voices without amplification. Motions were sung as much as spoken. The resonance made demagoguery difficult. You cannot bully a chord. Treaties on weights, on coinage alloys, on feast dates that governed labor cycles turned bazaars into legislatures. It looked like commerce. It was governance. This dispersed congress kept the empire agile. When drought hit the east, bells rang in the west to extend their planting festival, freeing grain to travel. When plague approached down a valley, caravans detoured along a ridge. The ridge road had been maintained for precisely this contingency, a redundancy written into landscape by ancestors who believed prudence was a civic rhythm. Third-star forts as switchboards. Those geometric strongholds the outside world took for military toys performed a quieter role. Messengers carrying treaty packets did not gallop alone. They moved from fort to fort, where rooms called ears listened for specific drum patterns. A code based on rhythmic groupings, easily heard over distance, hard to fake without the right skins and mallets, relayed urgent decisions across hundreds of miles in hours. Later, when lenses improved, heliograph variants joined the score. The forts were not only teeth, they were tongues. The fourth sea problem revisited. Tartaria could ignore the sea only so long. Silver from Potosi, spices from Maluku, tea from Fujian. Maritime powers pulled the world's sugars and stimulants into networks beyond any caravan's reach. Tartaria's answer was coy. It built threshold ports, harbors it never fully owned, but tuned in alliance with coastal polities. There, bells were cast to maritime intervals. Warehouses cooled with sea-specific vaults that dried canvas without killing it. Tartarian caravans, met Portuguese carracks, not as supplicants, but as equals who had something the sea could not move: continuity inland. This compromise inoculated without colonizing. Tartaria did not learn to sail the world, it learned to receive it without losing itself. When storms of empire tore other inland cultures, the resonant network bent and did not break. V. The ethics of limit. Expansion exhausts most empires because they mistake ambition for appetite. Tartaria's expansion looked like restraint. Provinces refused beyond certain hydrological lines. "Not our basin," a governor would say, and ambassadors blinked at the rudeness of wisdom. Borders learned to follow watershed, not whim. War still happened, but supply never pretended it could outrun geology. Restraint reads as weakness to men who believe maps are competitions. But in the 17th century, when a run of cold summers punished the northern hemisphere, Tartaria's cities absorbed shock more gracefully than neighbors. The bells adjusted labor calendars. The fairs rewrote rations. Baths warmed by resonance spared forests. Famine arrived late and left early. An empire that can say, "Enough," survives what kills empires that cannot. Coal is a spell that banishes patience. The Industrial Revolution taught Europe that time could be made to sprint if you fed it carbon fast enough. Telegraphs taught empires to twitch across continents like nervous systems on coffee. Rails nailed landscapes to schedules. In this storm, Tartaria, the civilization that tuned itself to cycles, met an adversary more intimate than Rome or Cannon. Urgency. First smoke versus song. A factory is a bell that rings all day in one note. Its song is extraction. Put such a bell in a resonant city, and you hear the conflict at once. The new looms hum at pitches that fatigue the old vaults. The baths dampen. The fountains sulk. Guilds complain, then protest, then concede to progress. A city that once breathed with its basin begins to pant. Tartaria is not Luddite. It tests. Some mills are moved to peripheries tuned to absorb monotone. Others are encased in baffles that turn their hum into heat. Waste captured for baths and bakeries. Engineers experiment with hybrid drives. Water resonance to start the wheel. Steam to hold it. Efficiency freaks from abroad scoff at the compromises. Local mothers appreciate that the laundry no longer smells of soot. Second telegraph versus treaty. The telegraph offers a seductive upgrade to the drum and light code. Councils adopt it cautiously, routing copper through star forts already cited as switchboards. Messages move faster, so do mistakes. A culture trained to echo and confirm by ritual suddenly trusts a wire that clicks in private rooms. Power centralizes by accident. A clerk who sits nearer the battery becomes a prince of timing. Countermeasures emerge. Bells once used for weather now mark the cadence of deliberation. No decision transmitted on a wire may be made without the corresponding cord rung in public. The ethic is simple. Speed may not outrun consent. In some crises, the rule costs lives. In most, it saves the Constitution from becoming an organ of the impatient. Third rail versus road. Railroads tempt any polity that values reliability. Tartaria signs concessions, but writes them like marriage contracts. Dowry of land, not dowry of soul. Rails must hug watershed. Stations must host baths. Whistles must not detune bells. A clause that causes laughter, then litigation, then new whistles. Freight schedules are integrated into fare calendars. Passenger timetables avoid the interval before the solstice festival, when streets belong to processions. Investors grumble that ritual disrupts revenue. The city replies, revenue that disrupts ritual is mispriced. Rails bring strangers faster than courtesy can train them. Fistfights multiply where whistles shriek. The solution is counterintuitive. Slow some trains. Through lines that ignore local rhythm are forced to pause for an hour at noon on market days. Economists howl. Merchants notice incidents fall and receipts rise. Harmony is not romance. It is arithmetic that counts all variables. Fourth, curriculum versus memory. Modern schools arrive with blackboards and bell schedules that ignore the city's choir. The curriculum prizes abstraction, algebra unmoored from bells, physics divorced from baths. A generation grooms itself to despise the chores that kept the city tuned. Apprenticeships thin, the rooflines wobble. Tartaria's answer is not nostalgia, but synthesis. It opens polytechnic fairs, exhibitions where resonance is demonstrated alongside turbines, where an old mason teaches dome ratios to a boy building a wireless set. Prize committees award a patent for a quiet motor, an induction machine cased in a resonant shell that hums in a civic key. If modernity insists on engines, the city insists those engines pass music class. V. The political temptation. Modernity carries an ideology, centralization masquerading as efficiency. When a drought strains 3 provinces, a minister suggests dissolving fairs in favor of a ministry that can act. The proposal is popular with newspapers that mistake speed for mercy. Councils resist. They show ledgers from the famine a century prior, and fairs rerouted grain faster than any single office because they trusted local gossip more than statistics. The compromise is a federation, a small center to coordinate crises, large peripheries to live. The center is housed not in a new palace, but in an old fort whose ears once heard drums. The symbolism is shameless and correct. A civilization survives modernity not by surrender, nor by rejection, but by domestication. The telegraph becomes a bell rope. Sixth, the carbon bargain. Coal demands sacrifice. Forests spared for centuries eye the axe as furnaces multiplied by fashion want heat without waiting for weather. Tartaria writes a bargain with the miners. For every shaft sunk, one bell recast to a pitch that cools. For every train laid, one bath warmed by its waste. For every factory granted a charter, one courtyard garden required within 1,000 paces. From afar this looks like quaint regulation. From inside, it feels like breathing. Cities elsewhere blacken and cough. Tartaria's cities grey at the edges, and then learn to clean themselves, cladding chimneys with resonant baffles that break soot, planting alley trees at spacings calculated to spin air. Modernity is not defeated, it is tutored. The result is slower profit and longer life. Investors who crave quarterly conquests withdraw to ports. Families stay. The census tells the truth. Newspapers cannot print. The empire grows without boasting. History accelerates in the 19th century. Coal darkens skies. Cables crawl under oceans. Railways stitch continents with iron threads. Britain masters the seas. America learns to industrialize. Russia expands relentlessly. In our timeline, these powers redrew the world's map. But if Tartaria still lived, if its resonant cities still breathed, then the 19th century would not belong to coal and empire alone. It would belong to the global contest between 2 civilizational grammars, one of extraction, one of harmony. I, Britain's ocean, Tartaria's land. Britain's genius was the navy. Wooden walls first, then steel hulls, projecting power across seas with sails, cannon, and coal. No empire before or since wrapped the oceans so tightly. Against this, Tartaria had no fleet of equal reach. Its power lived inland, in caravans and fairs, in cities tuned to rivers and roads. The contest was inevitable. Britain's India bumped against Tartaria's Central Asia. Caravans carrying silk and grain met frigates carrying tea and gunpowder. In London's parlours, Tartaria looked like hinterland, vast but provincial, a quilt of landlocked towns. But British merchants who travelled inland found themselves disarmed by a paradox. The deeper they went, the more civilized the wilderness seemed. Roads that repaired themselves, inns aligned to solstice breezes, markets that felt like legislatures. They have no navy, one merchant wrote, yet their land itself behaves like a fleet. carrying them with a speed we cannot match except on water. The two systems eyed each other like predators at a watering hole. Britain wanted monopoly. Tartaria wanted balance. Neither would yield easily. Second America the newcomer. Across the Atlantic, the United States rose as a republic of expansion. Railroads pushed west, factories roared east, and ideology wrapped itself in destiny. To Americans, Tartaria was a rumor. Half Russia, half myth. But American engineers obsessed with rail-read reports of Tartarian caravan routes and were unsettled. How could a wagon train in Asia rival the speed of their locomotives? How could inland fares coordinate with the efficiency of Washington without telegraphs? Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others copied. American architects experimented with domes and vaults inspired by Asiatic resonance. Farmers tinkered with wind harmonics to calm storms. None admitted the source. Inventions transplanted often become anonymous. But Tartaria's shadow walked quietly through the industrial heartland of America. Yet the cultures were incompatible. America worshipped speed. Tartaria worshipped rhythm. One wanted to conquer frontiers, the other to stabilize basins. A clash was coming, not of armies perhaps, but of ideals. Third Russia the rival, Russia the heir. The greatest threat to Tartaria was never Britain or America. It was Russia, the empire that sat at its edge, devouring pieces of its steppe, claiming pieces of its identity. In our history, Russia absorbed much of what was once called Tartary. But in this alternate chronicle, Tartaria still lives, and Russia cannot tolerate the mirror. For Russia is spectacle, palaces in St. Petersburg, armies parading in squares, czars crowned in gold. Tartaria is saturation, bells that hum, streets aligned, festivals that tune life. Russia wants centralization, Tartaria wants federation. Russia rules by decree, Tartaria by festival. Their border becomes a fault line, trembling with rivalry. Armies march, treaties falter, spies whisper. Russia insists it is heir to all the East. Tartaria insists it is itself. The struggle defines the century. Two colossal powers, locked not only in war but in narrative, each trying to tell the world who owns Eurasia. The industrial temptation, coal, steel, rail and telegraph seduced Tartaria as they seduced everyone. Fairs fill with steam engines, caravans hum with iron wheels. The temptation is clear. Abandon resonance, join the industrial rush, compete on Europe's terms. But Tartaria remembers its ethic. Bells are retuned to absorb factory noise. Rails are forced to pause for festivals. Telegraph lines are routed through star forts where councils monitor their use. Efficiency suffers, but harmony holds. It is a gamble. To outsiders, Tartaria looks backward, inefficient, unambitious. But when cholera rages in coal-black London, Tartaria's cities breathe cleaner air. When American factories burn out workers in 10 years, Tartaria's guilds train apprentices for life. The gamble is not glamorous. It does not impress investors, but it sustains a civilization. V. The contest of colonies. While Britain and France carve Africa, while America seizes the Philippines, Tartaria expands differently. Not colonies, but corridors. It builds trade routes through Persia, treaties with India, fairs in Central Asia. Instead of governors, it sends repairmen. Instead of armies, caravans. It looks unimpressive on maps. No pink blotches spreading across continents. No triumphs in Parliament. But the effect is quieter, deeper. Goods flow inland as steadily as rivers to the sea. People remember the bells, not the banners. Colonies revolt. Corridors endure. This too is conquest. Silent, resilient, unrecorded. Sixth, the First World War. That wasn't. In our timeline, the First World War was sparked by alliances entangled across Europe. But imagine Tartaria alive in that century. Its presence alters the equation. The Eurasian heart is no longer Russian, no longer submissive. Germany's eastward ambitions collide not with czars, but with resonance. Britain's Indian Empire faces not a void, but a corridor. The Ottoman Empire's decline meets not Russian expansion, but Tartarian resilience. The war still comes, perhaps, but it is different, less total, more localized, because Tartaria refuses to play Europe's game of absolute alliances. It insists on festivals, treaties, corridors. It slows the escalation, diffuses the catastrophe. Millions still die, but perhaps not tens of millions. The 20th century bends. 7. The global contest in summary. The 19th and early 20th centuries become the great test. Can a civilization of resonance survive against coal, steel, navy, and cannon? The answer, in this alternate world, is yes, but only just. Tartaria does not dominate. It resists, it bends, it absorbs. Its corridors spread, its festivals endure. It avoids collapse not by conquering the seas, but by reminding the land to breathe. But the contest is not over. For the 20th century will bring a new storm: electricity, radio, nuclear fire. And in that contest, Tartaria must prove whether resonance can harmonize with modernity, or whether it will finally break. Electricity arrived like lightning hitting a bell, a single shock that set everything humming in new keys. In Europe and America, wires went up before anyone understood what they were summoning. In Tartaria, where cities already thought in vibration and field, the question was never, can we use it? But how do we tune it? They began with respect. Bells that had governed markets and weather for centuries were recast to coexist with alternating current. Copper, which had been the quiet tendon of caravan scales and star-fought instruments, was called to a noisier duty. The old guilds, founders, masons, carpenters, adopted a new companion, the coil winders. They were not priests, but when they worked, people lowered their voices. The coil shop smelled of resin and beeswax. The masters listened more than they spoke. The first grid grew along the spine of the old caravan system. Star forts, already sited atop bedrock that behaved kindly under resonance, became substations. Watchmen whose fathers had beat drums now tended transformers that sighed at the edge of hearing. They wore the same coats in winter and learned to read the same sky. They still tapped the parapets at dawn to hear frost speak. A storm, one would say, and the foreman would spool more line, not because he feared wind, but because wind was an instrument too, and instruments should not be surprised. Tartaria refused to string wires like snares. Each line became another street in the great invisible city, routed with the same courtesy as stone lanes, never along a valley that twisted sound cruelly, always with an eye to the bells. Street lamps appeared not in rows, but in phrases. The cadence was deliberate. Pools of light where water always paused, pendant glow where wind slowed, quietness conserved in alleys that the old maps had marked for whispers. Children learned to tell directions by the colors of the glass. Elders smiled at a world that had found a new way to sing itself. The first turbines did not sit in dams. They sat in the old undercity, in cisterns, in sluices, in vaulted channels that once coaxed air and water into rhythm. The engineers called them instruments, because it was impossible not to. When the rotors turned, you could feel it in the stone like a cat purring in your lap. The city's baths warmed subtly, kitchens worked later without smoke. Market halls no longer needed braziers to wrestle winter. No one called this revolution. They called it ease. And in Tartaria, ease was a civic virtue. Academies blossomed that could never have grown anywhere else. A boy who had apprenticed in a bell foundry found himself diagramming sine waves beside a girl whose grandmother taught her which stones in the city wall held heat like bread. Professors with European degrees arrived certain that physics was a kingdom of numbers. They learned, within a season, that in these halls, mathematics was a language for etiquette. A wire did not carry a current, it hosted it. A coil did not force a field, it invited one. The vocabulary did not soften the work, it sharpened it, because anyone who hosts must think beyond themselves. Radio came to Tartaria as a familiar. The old towers, parabolic, onion, tapered, were nearly perfect for it. All they had to do was admit a secret that had been kept in the guilds. Certain domes had been singing for centuries. Now their voices leapt farther than anyone had asked them to. Farmers tracked rainfall by broadcasts that sounded like weather and were weather, sonorous minutes that slid from astronomy to admonition to song. Bring the sheep in. Close the northern vents. Boil the water 3 days hence. It was not a government telling them what to do, nor a prophet. It was a council that had earned the right to speak by never wasting a syllable. Static posed a problem. Lightning had always been a friend. Radio was a skittish new animal. The solution was not to flee the storm, but to court it. Copper spires, already tuned to bleed surge into the earth, were cuffed with rings that laughed at electricity, the way a willow laughs at wind. You could stand in a tower stair on a violent night and feel the building's pleasure, a shiver that did not fear. The difference between terror and thrill is whether a structure knows your name. Telephones arrived as invitations, not invasions. Houses added little chambers for them, with doors. Calls were taken sitting down, as if company had come by foot and brought cake. A mother's voice, newly amplified, travelled to a shop without raising itself to the street. The city felt the courtesy. America, impatient and magnificent, poured electrons in straight lines toward profit. Britain strung them across oceans and taught empires to twitch. Tartaria learned to modulate. It treated electricity like a musician in a crowded room. Someone with a gift who, if not tuned to the rest, would drown the conversation. The results looked like compromise, and were, in fact, mastery. The lights stayed warm, the nights stayed dark where they ought to be. The stars still mattered enough to schedule a festival by. Then came the 20th century's pair of monsters, total war and split atoms. War tested Tartaria's resolve to keep power public. In other places, grids became military targets, and then military instruments. In Tartaria, substations were never alone. No single cut could quiet a city. Circuits learned the old caravan trick, redundancy like braided rope. When bombers droned, wards of streets went dim by design, and others brightened quietly, as if the city had moved its heart beneath its ribcage to avoid a blow. Refugees navigating the dark knew where to go by bells, with hidden lamps. They did not curse the planners. They cursed the war, and then they slept. Nuclear research posed a different question. Not how to survive a blow, but whether to become the kind of civilization that would throw one. The physics academies could not pretend the atom was a rumor. Their students could read foreign journals and had their own experiments with radium and cloud chambers. Decisions hardened. A council of bell founders, grey hair, blunt thumbs, memory of earthquakes, sat across from young men with equations on their cuffs. If it is power you want, the elders said, we have rivers and wind and sun and stone that can behave like organs in a body. The atom is a bone marrow you can poison by thinking about it wrong. Elsewhere, nations built weapons that ate the future. Tartaria built reactors that never reached war. They were small, like rooms. People visited them the way you might visit a bakery at dawn, with awe, with respect, with gossip. The third chamber hums today, someone would say, and a grandmother would nod like a woman hearing a grandchild sleep. Good, she'd say. It means the river is happy. Was this superstition? Ask the engineers who designed shielding by borrowing ratios from basilicas. Ask the nurses who monitored blood with instruments tuned to the bells. Ask the city that never once evacuated because of its own hand. Electronics only deepened the civics. Computers arrived as counting houses and quickly learned diplomacy. Networks grew like ivy, not like barbed wire. Information traveled where trust had already built trellises. Guild to guild, fort to fort, school to farm. Firewalls wore folk names because their work was a human art. Auntie replies to strangers and delays them with tea. Uncle refuses the men with briefcases, but invites their daughters for supper. Security by hospitality sounds impossible until you live in a place that knows where its doors ought to be. Once, a visiting minister from a modern capital asked why Tartaria's city networks ran slower than his own. He was polite about it, a man who had learned to simulate humility. The chief of the switchboard took him to the roof. "Do you see that hawk?" she asked, pointing to a bird riding a noon current. He nodded, unsure whether he was being mocked. "That is our benchmark," she said. "If this city's network startles the hawk, it is too fast." He left unconvinced, and later wrote a paper about romantic latency. Meanwhile, a generation grew up in Tartaria that never learned the word buffering, and never learned the disease of being unable to hear a friend speak because a million strangers were shouting at once. The last transformation was the most delicate, bringing computation into the old bells. A team of students wrote software that listened to the city the way a bell tuner listens to bronze. The program did not command lights on and off, it suggested. The council, human, not machine, approved. The city breathed more easily. A winter market that had always been a bit cruel to old knees softened. A summer night that used to boil behind a cotton warehouse exhaled. Winters passed. Children in wool hats ran strings between lampposts and sang to them. The posts answered with a barely audible throbbing in the fingertips. "It's saying hello," the children declared, and mothers did not correct them. In Tartaria, a city that says hello is good governance. Electricity was not an occupation. It was a conversation between forces the civilization already honored. The result was a grid that felt like a garden, pruned, irrigated, alive, and above all, owned by no one who could afford to hate the people walking through it. Where then did Tartaria stand against the world that ran headlong into the electric century? It stood at an angle, neither blocking nor obeying. Its cities offered safe harbor to scientists who fled regimes that adored speed more than truth. They found laboratories with walls that sang and councils that insisted experiments be explained to the street. Some left, chafed by the demand. Others stayed, relieved to remember why they had wanted to learn at all. The final test of this age was catastrophe not of human making. A decade of weather wrong-footed continents, crop failures, blackouts, rivers sulking in their beds. Elsewhere, grids fell like anxious men. In Tartaria, bells changed key, and the city changed with them. Farmers switched seed a week earlier without needing a decree. Electric baths warmed the old. Concerts moved to mornings to spare the noon. A million small corrections rose from a million hands. The crisis did not pass because someone solved it. It passed because everyone tuned. That is electricity, as Tartaria understood it. A force as dangerous as fire, as intimate as breath. You do not conquer breath. You learn to breathe with it. Walk into a Tartarian metropolis today, and the first sensation is not spectacle, but kindness. The air sits right on the skin. The light does not scold. The noise is a woven thing, loud where it should be, quiet where it must. The skyline has no apologies to make for its beauty, and yet nothing feels forced to be beautiful. You can tell when you step onto a street that was drawn to please a season, and when you step onto one that serves a storm. This is a capital, but the map refuses to say where exactly the center is. Power here is braided, not stacked. A ring of star-fought parks holds the densest neighborhoods the way a belt holds a dancer's weight. Inside the ring, the oldest bells occupy towers that share their roofs with telescopes and weather masts. The bells ring rarely now, and when they do, the phones in 1,000 pockets vibrate in sympathy. No one looks down to check. They already know what the notes mean. Energy is a utility the way air is a utility. Every building generates something and shares something. Photonic glass on roofs, coils in floors that sip at the Earth's heat, small turbines tucked where alleys funnel wind. The grid is not a hierarchy but a commons. Managed by a charter, everyone learns in the same way they learn to cross streets. You do not take more than your courtyard can forgive, a father tells a teenager plugging in a kiln. The boy nods, not because he is afraid of fines, but because his grandmother's courtyard is a person, and his grandmother would be disappointed. Transport is the second kindness. Trains arrive like sentences, not like alarms. They are never late. They are sometimes slow on purpose. A festival day leans into the timetable like a shoulder at a door. The platform boards remind you where you are with stories and temperatures and tide times and small gossip sanctioned by a council that knows gossip, too, is data. The trains sing when they leave, a different chord in each district, tuned so the city can tell from any balcony how its limbs are moving. Cars exist. They are small, polite, and somewhat embarrassed to be cars. They are allowed into streets that know them by name, and not allowed into streets that do not. Most people walk, because walking is faster than impatience in a place where shade is a policy and benches are positioned by elders who keep undeserved secrets, like where the wind forgets to be cruel. Governance is visible and boring, which is to say, legitimate. Councils sit in rooms with microphones that sound like the market halls, warm, intelligible, unglamorous. There is an upper chamber for emergencies, composed of guild masters and teachers, repair captains and nurses, chosen by a method that would make a game theorist weep with relief, sortition from a pool of people who have already done hard things well in public. They meet rarely. When they do, the bells announce the fact, and cafes turn their chairs to face the live broadcast. Children are forgiven homework if they can summarize the debate. The best summaries win baths for their block. Baths? A visitor asks, trying not to smirk. Yes, baths. They are as old as the city and as modern as superconductors. They are not spas. They are where neighborhoods wash, argue, forgive, and vote with their feet. In Tartaria, the bathhouse is the original social medium. Hot water, acoustic privacy, civic heat. A budget that cannot fund baths, cannot fund theaters, and a city without either is a city at risk of remembering only its most expensive thoughts. Education is a garden you can walk through without enrollment. Workshops leak into alleys. Laboratories keep their windows open. Observatories project their night sky into the square. The schools have walls, but no gate feels like a gate. A baker can wander into a coding lesson because she overheard a metaphor she liked. A teenager running a small radio mast on his roof can wander into a seminar on clouds because he was asked to help tune a microphone. Degrees exist. Honor does too. Neither is a cudgel. Money exists. Its manners have been taught. Markets run hot at the right times and cold at the right times. Usury is a proverb people laugh at before they stop laughing. Banks are guilds that watch one another like sisters. There are rich people. They are never invited to speak first. And when they do speak first by accident, the bells pretend not to have heard them. Real wealth, which is time that fits, is measured by the frequency with which a person is asked to teach what they know. Religion thrives where it does not insist, argues where it must, and receives, with occasional blushing, the compliment of being copied in secular rooms. A sermon that scolds the grid into kindness becomes civic policy a season later without anyone claiming authorship. A council that wants to shame a vainer council quotes a poet no one admits to respecting until everyone hums the line. Art is not a department. It is what the city pays attention to when it is trying to remember itself. Music owns a larger share of public money than war. War has a budget. It is small. It is not zero. Tartaria's soldiers are taught to repair roofs and bridges before they are taught to break anything. They carry instruments more often than flags. An invading army would call this moral frivolity. An invading army would find, after the first bridge fell down in boredom beneath them, that moral frivolity is a weapon. On maps, Tartaria is an archipelago of basins, rather than a single blob. The corridors between them are protected like arteries. No tolls, no sudden walls, 1,000 small villages that know exactly how much freight they can digest without becoming highways. Borders feel like watersheds do, lines you can cross once you learn how rain prefers to move. Customs officers are repairmen with stamps. Outside powers still exist. They are respectable. Some are admirable. They are invited frequently. They are asked gently to take their shoes off. America respects Tartaria's stubbornness and buys software that breathes. Europe envies its baths and copies them less skillfully than it should. Britain sends choirs. China sends trains and receives in return a calendar that makes its heat waves less murderous. Russia sulks forever with a secret admiration it cannot quite forgive itself for feeling. Conflict does not disappear. Humans remain messy, greedy, noble, and tired. Tartaria's present future is not utopia. It is something less cinematic and more precious. A civilization that has decided, stubbornly, to keep itself tuned. When a plaza cracks, 3 guilds argue, 1 guild apologizes, the other 2 bring tea, and a child draws the new seam with chalk. When a politician tries to turn a festival into a rally, the crowd sings a song that swallows his microphone and hands him bread. When a company attempts to privatize a river, 1,000 bells ring a note that says, in a language lawyers do not like, no. The internet lives here. It is not a hedge maze of addiction. It is an orchard. You can pick fruit until you are full. You can also prune, and you must. Tending is a right. The worst thing one can be in Tartaria is a bystander, and the only sin technology can commit is to make bystanders of us. Night falls in a present-future city. The lamps rise like constellations, designed by someone who loved sleep. On a balcony, a grandmother listens to a bell. She hears weather, law, gossip, astronomy, patience. The children on the steps below her have devices in their hands. The devices are silent. The street is not. The city hums, and the hum is invitation, not command. This is dominance, if the word must be used. Not measured in territory or GDP or tonnage, but in how many places on the planet can say, with clean breath and a straight back, we kept the world's rhythm without needing to own the world. In that sense, Tartaria dominates quietly, as wind dominates a sail, because the sailor learned the difference between arrogance and skill. Stand at the edge of 2 timelines and look down. In one, Tartaria vanished into a curriculum that preferred steel to stone and speed to breath. In the other, the one we have followed, Tartaria endures, not as a crown, but as a grammar of care. What is the legacy of that choice? What lessons travel from this imagined empire back into any city that wants to live? First, technology is temperament. A steam engine can be a tyrant or a servant, depending on whether a bell gets to speak before the switch is thrown. The grid can be a whip or a commons. The network can be a mob or a choir. None of these outcomes is inevitable. All of them are choices disguised as engineering. Second, Infrastructure is a constitution. Star forts that act as switchboards, baths as public squares, bells as calendars. These are not amenities. They are the articles by which a people governs itself. Replace them with cheaper versions, and you do not save money, you betray a treaty. The bill arrives later with interest named loneliness. Third, pace is policy. The best argument for slowness is not romance, it is safety. Decision-making that waits for a bell to ring is not archaic if the bell is a covenant about who gets to consent. A train that pauses for a market saves more lives than an ambulance celebrated in a parade. Fourth, redundancy is kindness. A road with a shadow road, a grid with a shadow grid, a council with a shadow quorum of elders who remember floods. That is not waste. It is an apology written in advance to the future. In this ledger, apologies earn interest. Fifth, beauty is maintenance performed in public. To align a window with a wind is an act of politics. To tune a square so 1,000 voices can be understood without amplification is an act of love. The opposite of ugliness is not prettiness, it is attention. Sixth, sovereignty begins in the mouth. A city that knows the names of its winds cannot be ruled easily by a man who knows only the names of his donors. A child taught to hear when a wall has fallen out of tune cannot be convinced that nothing can be done. Seventh, conquest is not always theft. Sometimes it is persuasion so patient that the conquered forget they were convinced. Tartaria's silent conquests, the habits, calendars, repairs, show that influence without humiliation lasts longer than dominance without joy. Eighth, catastrophe is a teacher whose tuition you can prepay. A bell that changes key before a storm is not mystical. It is evidence that 1,000 small intelligences are listening. When attention scales, panic shrinks. Ninth, the future is a festival. Whoever controls the calendar controls the city, not to command obedience, but to orchestrate work and rest, commerce and grace. The great mistake of modernity was to schedule only profit. The repair is to schedule relief and then refuse to cancel it. Finally, memory is a utility. Treat it as luxury, and someone will steal it to decorate a museum. Treat it as water, and you will build aqueducts no army can drink dry. In the mirror of this imagined Tartaria, any present city can see itself more clearly. The mirror does not demand that we copy onion domes or carve star forts. It asks whether our hospitals sound like mercy, whether our schools smell like bread, whether our networks make hawks nervous. It asks whether we have the courage to say enough to appetites that call themselves destiny. If Tartaria existed, then the world we inherited is a world mid-sentence. If Tartaria did not, then the world we want is a world we can still write. In both cases, the method is the same. Listen, tune, repeat. The bells we need are not only cast in bronze, they are cast in habits we dare to defend. A last scene, not for nostalgia but for instruction. A child stands beneath a tower at dawn. The copper is old and green, the stone warm from yesterday's sun. A bell rings once, low, like a giant clearing its throat. Then once again, higher and quicker, like a bird deciding to launch. The child does not look for a screen to tell her what it means. She knows, the river is high, the market will be early, the trains will sing the westbound chord, and tonight the lamps will stay a shade dimmer, because the stars have business. She runs to tell her grandmother. The old woman nods, ties her scarf, and opens the door. The city inhales. Somewhere, an engineer closes a circuit. Somewhere else, a mason checks a seam. Somewhere else still, a council pours tea into chipped cups and sets out bread. The day begins, not with an order, but with a note. That is dominance worth wanting, not over others, but over forgetfulness, not over land, but over the laziness that would make us smaller than our weather. If Tartaria continues into the present future, it does so as a promise kept daily. We will not let the world fall out of tune without trying to sing it back. And if it is only a story, then let us be the kind of people who build as if the story were true, who cast our bells in the shape of the care we owe each other, who lay our streets along the grain of wind and water, who schedule our courage the way our ancestors scheduled their festivals, and who remember, when electricity dazzles and headlines shout, that a city is strongest when its hum is gentle. That hum is waiting everywhere. It is in the brick that warms when you rest your hand, in the window that admits light without bragging, in the quiet corner where a grandmother breathes easier than she did last winter. It is in the sky that has forgiven us more than we deserve, and in the mouths of children who have learned to hear. May we learn faster, may we tune sooner, may we, whether Tartaria once stood or only stands in us, be worthy of the bells.